This is the last section of Activity 4. We'll be adding and subtracting fractions. In order to add and subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. Once you have the common denominator, you simply add or subtract the numerators and leave the denominators alone. Then reduce the sum if necessary. Here in these examples, in the first one we're adding 1/5 plus 2/5. We add the numerators and get 3 and leave the denominator alone, and the answer is 3/5. In the next one, we're adding 3/8 plus 1/8, which equals 4/8. And since 4/8 is not in lowest terms, we reduce it to 1/2. In the subtraction examples, we have 8/13 minus 2/13, which equals 6/13. In the next one, we have 11/12 minus 7/12, which equals 4/12. And since that is not lowest terms, we reduce it to 1/3. Here's the process for adding fractions. If you have a common denominator, you simply add the numerators, leave the denominator alone, and reduce the fractions if needed. If you do not have a common denominator, you first have to find the lowest common denominator by writing out the multiples of each denominator until you come to one that is common to both denominators. Then you write the equivalent fractions using the lowest common denominator. You add the numerators, leaving the denominator alone, and reduce to lowest terms if necessary. In this example, we're adding 2/3 plus 1/5. I don't have a common denominator, so I would write out the multiples of 3 and the multiples of 5, and the lowest common denominator between them is 15. Now I write the equivalent fractions using the lowest common denominator and add. So I would have 10/15 plus 3/15 equals 13/15. The second example, I'm adding 3/8 plus 5/20. Again, I don't have a common denominator, so I would write out the multiples of each denominator and find that the lowest common denominator would be 40. Then I would write the built-up fractions, and I would have 15/40 plus 10/40 equals 25/40. Since that's not reduced, I would reduce it to 5/8. Again, to subtract fractions, you must have a common denominator. If you already have a common denominator, then you would subtract the numerators, leave the denominators alone, and then reduce the fractions if necessary. If you do not have a common denominator, you find the lowest common denominator by writing out the multiples of each denominator until you come to the one that is common to both denominators. Then write the equivalent fractions using the lowest common denominator. Then subtract the numerators, leaving the denominators alone, and reduce to lowest terms if necessary, the answer. In the first example, I'm subtracting 6/11 minus 5/11. I subtract the numerators and I get 1/11. In the next example, I'm subtracting 7/9 minus 1/9, which equals 6/9. And since that's not in lowest terms, I reduce 6/9 to 2/3. In the next example, I'm subtracting 1/3 minus 1/8. Since they don't have a common denominator, I would write out the multiples of each denominator and find that the lowest common denominator is 24. Then write the built-up fractions, which would be 8/24 minus 3/24 equals 5/20, and do the subtraction, and I get 5/24.